Okay, so this chapter, the MPEP 1200, this is all about appeals. And so this is actually probably my favorite chapter. It's a really interesting one to read. So I would definitely, and it's only 77 pages, so definitely recommend reading it. I think everything I've read has said that appeals and reexaminations, there was a lot of that on the test. So worth the read for sure. So kind of just starting out here. So for appeal basics, so all of it is consolidated under CFR 41. That's where the consolidated rules for appeal are. And so if you are really lost in the exam, that's going to be, just if you've read any of the CFR, then you kind of know what those look like. It's helpful, but really, if you're able to look it up in the MPEP, that's going to be better because there's just some things in there that even if they seem like they say one thing, the MPEP seems to interpret it a little bit differently. So that's just my 2 cents, but kind of do whatever needed on that day, of course. So now this action can be taken after second actions or final rejections. So that's kind of an important distinction. So even if it's just a second office action, you can put forth an appeal. It doesn't have to be like with a request for continued examination and those ones, prosecution has to be closed. But in this case, prosecution does not have to be closed. So kind of an important distinction. A defective appeal brief can be fixed within 1 month of filing, but a real party of interest changes must be notified within 20 days. So there's a different assignee, a different full licensor, any of that would need to be fixed pretty quickly. If a notice of appeal is filed first, and then the applicant changed their mind and filed an RCE, the applicant must file an extension of time, even if it's within 3 months from the final action. So this is kind of a tricky area. But basically, what my understanding of this is when a notice of appeal is filed, it's immediately changing the course of the application. So now the application is barreling towards an appeal. And so by not filing an appeal brief, you're changing it back to prosecution. And so you need to file an extension to go beyond that office action because technically you had stopped that term of reply. And so you need to extend that term of reply, even if it's within the 3 month statutory that was given. So maybe read 1205.01 if I didn't explain that right, which truthfully, I did not explain it very well. So definitely look that up if you need to. All right, so now the timeline. To me, this was really helpful for appeals because there's a lot of replies and answers. And so it was really helpful to write out a timeline for me. So starting out, you have your notice of appeal plus a fee. And there's a 2 month extendable deadline to file the appeal brief. And so when we say extendable, we're saying automatically extendable up to 5 months. So under rule 1.136A, it can be extended up to 5 months, so 7 months total, because remember the statutory period from the office action doesn't apply here. So then after that, after you file the appeal brief, you can file that appeal brief without fee within that 2 month extendable deadline. And so then after the appeal brief comes the examiner's answer. And so now the examiner's answer sets forth a 2 month extendable for cause timeline for the reply brief. So then the reply brief, which is optional, that can be filed in that time period. And then it's going to be the Board of Appeals will then take over the jurisdiction after the reply brief is filed or after the expiration of time period for filing the reply brief. So it could be 1 month later if the reply brief is filed within 1 month, or it could be, of course, 2 months in that case. So then there comes the board decision, and then the applicant options kind of vary from there. So really just a basic rundown. We'll get way deeper here in a moment. But that's kind of a helpful timeline. Feel free to write that out however you want. To me, it was just, I've written that a few times now, and that's been helpful. So starting out with the notice of appeal. So it can be filed with the certificate of mailing or the certificate of transmission. And that filing date is going to be given as sent or the USPS date and date. And so if you remember the this is kind of a weird ruling that we had talked about in the MPEP 500 review, where the notice of appeal, let's say it needed to be filed within a 3 month period from the office action, even if it's filed on the last day with a certificate of mailing, then it counts as being filed based on the date and date. But the receipt or the appeal brief deadline is calculated from the receipt at the PTO. So that's just an important distinction to remember, that the date in date given by the certificate of mailing or certificate of transmission is not what the appeal brief deadline is calculated from. So it might end up helping a little bit if you needed a few more days to get that together. It doesn't have to be signed or identify the claims being appealed. It really just has to say that the applicant is wanting to move forward with an appeal and send in the fee. So now the appeal brief. The appeal brief needs to identify the real party of interest, so whoever's licensed or assigned, whoever's in charge there, any related appeals or interferences, and if none are listed, then the USPTO just assumes there's none. They're not going to go searching for any of them. A summary of the claim subject matter, wherein the dependent and independent claims are argued separately. So then you also might see some questions, some practice exam questions talking about standing or falling together. So that can happen when in the arguments for each rejection. So you can write those separately from each other, but it can also be argued as a group or a subgroup. But you want to be really careful when you do that, because the board has the right to choose one claim from a group that's defined that way and then make a decision just based on that claim. So it can be a little bit risky actually to do that. And then it also needs to include an appendix with a copy of the claims appealed. And then no new or non-admitted evidence can be used. So that would make it a non-compliant appeal brief. So any non-admitted, that could be something where an amendment was filed, but it wasn't entered by the examiner. That can't be brought up in the appeal brief. And then any evidence, it has to be entered by the examiner in order to be discussed here. So now the amendments for after filing of appeal. So if an appellant wants the examiner to review the decision to enter an amendment or evidence, the petition for reconsideration has to be done to the director within 2 months. That's a really important time period there. And this is for amendments between the filing of the appeal and the appeal brief. And that is based on Rule 1.181F, and that is the petitioning director rule. And that is based on the mailing date of the examiner decision to not enter the document. And so anything after the filing of appeal is not a matter of right. Now, if it's after notice of appeal, but before filing of an appeal brief, same as this whole section, you can cancel the claims. You can file something that complies with requirements. You can present the rejected claims in better form, or amend specification with reasoning why this wasn't done earlier. So basically, if you see a question that's talking about filing of amendments after the notice of appeal, any question or any answer that talks about adding new claims, immediately rule that out, because that would be bringing up new issues and it will more than likely not be entered. Now, after the filing of an appeal brief, the only amendments which can be entered are those which cancel the claims and those which rewrite the dependent into independent form. And I think it's very helpful to memorize both of these. So next, what would happen is the examiner's answer. So the examiner, in their answer, so they're answering the appeal brief before this goes to the appeal board, they can set forth a new ground of rejection. They can say, okay, we kind of looked at what you were saying. We have made these changes in response, and now you can respond from there. So now the applicant after that can either reopen the prosecution by responding to that action. They can maintain the same appeal and then respond to the new ground with a reply brief. So basically, if you only respond to the action and you don't make it clear that you are maintaining the appeal, then the appeal is immediately abandoned. So you have to make it clear that you're maintaining the appeal. Now, if the new grounds are laid out but not identified, then the applicant can request that ground be identified with that petition and fee under 1.81. And so basically any petition to the director has to be done within 2 months. That new ground cannot reject a formally allowed or objected claim. So if it was a claim, so when we're saying objected claim, that might be something where there's an independent claim 1, a dependent claim 2, and the dependent claim 2 is allowable except that it's objected because claim 1 is rejected. So in that case, it can't become rejected at this point. And then if something was allowed before, then the new ground cannot make it rejected again. So that new ground cannot reject that formally allowed or objected claim. So some examples of new ground are changing the statutory basis from 103 to 102 with new references. And I apologize, this will say vice versa. So when you're changing that statutory base, that's okay if it's with the same references, but if new references are used, then that's an unfair, that's kind of unfair to the applicant, and so that would be an example of a new ground. If new calculations are cited for overlapping ranges, if there's a new matter rejection. And then as far as what would not count as new ground, and I could definitely see this being an area for some easy questions. If it's citing a different portion of the reference, that would not count as new ground. Changing the statutory basis without changing references, so kind of what we said before. Fewer references but the same teaching. So in the case of a 103 objection, you were formerly using 4 references to make that objection and were able to bring it down to 3. Then in that case, that's not new ground because it's the same references. There's nothing new for the practitioner to go over. So now what can happen, this is an optional step, this is the oral hearing. So now a request for the oral hearing can be filed with a fee 2 months after the mailing of examiner's answer. So it has to be filed within that time. I believe you can get extensions for cause, but more than likely you just need to file it within that time. Oh yeah, it is extendable for cause only. And then there is a fee. And so it'd be best to just do it at the same day as filing a reply brief, because pretty much when you file that reply brief, you're stopping that time period. And so it's just best to just file the request for an oral hearing at that point. However, if no oral hearing is requested, the board will decide to appeal with just those papers filed, and that won't affect your application in any way. So next would be the reply brief. And so that would need to be filed 2 months after the mailing of an examiner's answer. That can be extendable with cause, and it does include a forwarding fee. But that forwarding fee actually has to be paid whether or not the reply brief is filed. It's basically just saying, yes, we want to move forward into the appeal, and so it's forwarding it from the examiner's jurisdiction into the appeal jurisdiction. So now if a new ground is identified, but it's not replied to with a reply brief, then the application will be sua sponte dismissed. So that's when an examiner says, hey, we have put forward a new ground, but the applicant did not say they would maintain the appeal or reopen prosecution. If there's no indication of what should be done, then it's going to be sua sponte, which means, it's just dismissed on the merits. So now the board could remand the case back to the examiner if some argument needed to be responded to by the examiner. And then in that case, the examiner would respond with a substitute examiner's answer. And then, there's a couple other actions that will happen. We'll go over here. So now when we're looking at the board decision, they may affirm the examiner either in whole or in part. They might reverse the examiner, same fractions there. Remand the case back to examiner, where the examiner would submit supplemental answers or supplemental replies, what that's supposed to say. Or they can issue a new ground of rejection. So that can all happen. The issuing new ground of rejection can happen in any of those cases. So now the applicant option in the case of a new rejection is to submit an amendment and have the examiner respond. So by submitting an amendment, you're kind of opening prosecution. And so then after the examiner responds, then that decision can then be appealed again. And then the applicant can have their new rejection considered immediately by the board. Now the applicant has 2 months to respond to any of the board decisions here. And that can be either with a rehearing or a petition to have a new ground of rejection designated as such if it has not been already. So now the applicant moves after a board decision. So first off, they can file a continuation, file an RCE, expressly abandon, continue or withdraw appeal. And then if you're disappointed with all decisions, you don't want to do any of that, you're just frustrated with the back and forth of the board, then you can file an appeal with the federal circuit or the district court. So now the district court, that will allow new evidence, and all of these moves must be made within 2 months, 63 days specifically, of a board decision or 2 months of reconsideration by the board. And that's a decision of the reconsideration. And so by filing an appeal with the federal court, the applicant waives any right to file civil action. So this isn't explicitly said, but kind of my understanding is you can file a civil action and then still file with the federal circuit. But once you've filed with the Federal Circuit, you've already waived all right to civil action. So now the examiner, if they are sustained in part, this is an important scenario that I've seen in a couple example questions. And so these would just be good ones to remember. So first off, if claims 1 and 2 are pending, and let's say claim 1 is independent, claim 2 is dependent on claim 1, the board may affirm the rejection on an independent claim 1, and claim 2 is objected to for only the reason that it's dependent on a rejected claim. In that case, those claims stand abandoned. So if the board didn't say anything else, then those claims stand abandoned. There's nothing you can do except for file continuation. Now, if claims 1 and 2 are pending, the board affirms the rejection of claim 1, but reverses the objection on claim 2, wherein all other claims may depend on claim 1, so that could be reverses the objection on claim 2, 3, 4. In that case, the examiner can then convert the claim 2 into an independent claim via an examiner's amendment, and then cancel any rejected claims. And so then those claims would go to allowance. The other option is the examiner can set a 2-month time limit to rewrite the dependent claims into independent forms, and the application will be abandoned if the applicant does not timely reply. So if there's no claims allowed, then the application would go to abandonment, but this is kind of, almost extending an olive branch saying, hey, you would be able to get some claims allowed if you made these moves here. So now if claims are allowed, so this can be whether through a reversal of the examiner or claims which were already allowed, the application will proceed to issue, and the examiner will make those formality changes normally. So if it's an ex parte quail, so that's the one where it's like almost in condition for allowance, the examiner will just make those changes a lot of times. So the claims will either go to issue or the examiner will issue a notice of abandonment is kind of the two routes here. Now, if the board reverses the decision on elected claims leading to an allowance, then those non-elected claims can be reconsidered for a rejoinder. So if you remember in the MPEP 800, there was a lot of talk about elections and how that would go down. And so basically, if the board says, hey, well, this group of elected claims is allowed, then the applicant can come back and say, well, we would like these claims brought back into the non-elected claims brought back into the case. And so all of that can be found in the MPEP 800. So definitely consider reading that if that question comes up. So now when it comes to withdrawing the appeal, so after an appeal brief is filed and after the period for reply to a final rejection, an application stands abandoned on the day the letter is received. So that's with an express abandonment. So now if the brief was filed, the answer was mailed, but the transfer of jurisdiction did not occur, then the examiner would handle the abandonment, right? So we're saying the examiner answer was mailed, but there was no reply brief, there was a withdrawal of appeal at this point, then because the application is still under the examiner's jurisdiction, the examiner would handle the abandonment. Now, if the jurisdiction has been transferred to the board, so a reply brief has been filed, then in that case, the board would handle the abandonment. Now, an RCE can be filed at the same time as a withdrawal of appeal in all cases except utility or plant prior to 6/8/95, a design, because remember design, you would use CPA instead, in a reexamination, which is a very good one to remember there. So then there's a sua sponte dismissal of appeal, which can occur anytime replies are not full or timely filed. So now for post-grant proceedings, these are just things that can happen if there is an appeal in post-grant proceedings, which I think is helpful to look at. So now an applicant in a re-exam proceedings cannot file a civil action. They can only appeal in the federal circuit if possible. Only an appeal in the federal circuit is possible. Same for inter partes review, post-grant review, or covered business methods. They can only be appealed in the federal court. Now for derivation proceedings, those can file in the federal circuit or with a civil action. And I think that's because there's two parties really involved in that case. So now the adverse party in the derivation would probably want those proceedings to be under civil action, because I think they would have more rights in that case, as far as bringing forth new evidence and that sort of thing. And that is it. So hopefully you get a chance to read it. It's a pretty fun chapter. pretty fun read.